Welcome back to the Missouri River Bottom Fort X Mega Farm. Today, the massive wheat harvest continues as we tackle over 600 acres of winter wheat across two enormous fields. If you've been following along, you'll know that in the last episode, we finally wrapped up harvesting the first of those fields, and it was an absolute monster. That first field alone was over 350 acres in size, making it the biggest wheat field on the farm, and when all was said and done, it brought in more than 2 million liters of grain. That's a huge haul, and one of the biggest wheat harvests we've ever seen here on a mega farm. Now that the first field is in the books, we've moved our 4 massive combines across the road and dived into the second and final wheat field of the season. This one's slightly smaller, coming in at 250 acres, but don't let that fool you. When you're talking about fields this size, even the small one is still massive. By the time we finish, we'll have millions of liters of wheat stored in our silo system. And once the market prices climb, that's going to translate into another massive payday for the farm. But the profits don't stop with the wheat itself. I've been hinting at it for a while now. And today's the day we're finally kicking off the huge straw baling operation that's going to follow this harvest. The plan is to bale every last bit of straw from both wheat fields. And to make sure we've got the horsepower for the job, I'll be purchasing 2 brand new New Holland BB 9090 Heston square balers. These are the biggest balers I could find, and each one produces absolutely massive bales, holding 13,000 liters of straw apiece. That means we'll be cranking out thousands of liters of straw every single pass. And when it's all said and done, the straw alone will bring in a huge chunk of extra profit. Of course, new balers mean we need more tractors to pull them. So I'll also be adding 2 brand new John Deere 8225R tractors to the fleet. These tractors will be paired up with the Heston balers and sent straight into the first 350-acre field we finished harvesting, while the combines continue chewing through the second field across the road. That means for the first time this season, we'll have 2 massive operations running side by side, for combines harvesting wheat on one side, and 2 big balers rolling across hundreds of acres of straw on the other. It's going to be one of the most productive days we've ever had here on the Missouri River Bottom Mega Farm. By the end of today, not only will we have wrapped up the entire wheat harvest for year 4, but we'll also be kicking off one of the largest baling projects in Farming Simulator 25. Big combines, big balers, big tractors, and big profits. Everything you'd expect from farming at this scale. So buckle in, because there's a lot of work to get done today. Let's fire up the engines, roll out the machines, and get back to work on the Missouri River Bottom Mega Farm. If you're enjoying the Missouri River Bottom Mega Farm series, please like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe.